What happens when a federal judge walks into her own courthouse and gets treated like she doesn't belong? No title, no robe, just her and the truth of how the system sees people who look like her. She was detained, humiliated, stripped of her dignity in a room with no cameras. But the officers didn't know one thing. The woman they mocked would soon be the one holding their fate in her hands. This isn't a courtroom drama. It's a true story of what happens when silence breaks, power is held accountable, and justice finds its voice, even if it comes late. Because this time, the judge didn't just hear the case, she became the case. Let me show you how one quiet moment of disrespect turned into a national reckoning. The courthouse was quiet that morning, just after sunrise, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before the building comes to life with motions, arguments, and verdicts. Lorraine Bennett walked in alone, dressed in a plain navy blouse and gray slacks. No security detail, no badge, just a leather briefcase and a slow, steady gait that came from 30 years in the legal system. She was used to being early. She wasn't used to being stopped. At the security checkpoint, Deputy Marshal Brent Hanley looked her over. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't greet her. He just stepped in front of her path and said, "Ma'am, this entrance is for staff only." "I am staff," Lorraine replied, calmly. Hanley crossed his arms. "You'll need to wait outside while I check your story." No matter how many times it happened, that particular phrase never lost its sting. Check your story. She was escorted to a private screening room. No cameras, no witnesses. There, Hanley asked her to empty her bag, remove her shoes, and finally, without any cause or legal grounds, told her, "Let's make sure you're not hiding anything else." Then he took clippers from a drawer. Lorraine sat still as he shaved her head. There was no medical reason, no warrant, just power, exercised with a smirk. He laughed as hair fell to the floor. "You folks always like to act important. Guess that won't be so easy now, huh?" She said nothing. Not a word. Not then. But when it was over, she stood up, smoothed the front of her blouse, and walked out of the room without a glance back. Lorraine didn't go home. She went to the judge's chambers. 15 minutes later, she emerged in full judicial robe, every step echoing through the marble corridor. Inside the courtroom, attorneys stood when she entered, because that's what you do when a federal judge takes the bench. Deputy Hanley was in the gallery. He froze when he saw her face. The laughter was gone, the smirk erased, because the woman he'd humiliated wasn't a visitor. She was Judge Lorraine Bennett, one of the most respected jurists in the state, and she hadn't come to forget. She had come to rule. The wooden doors swung open with a soft creak, and the courtroom rose instinctively. It was procedural, automatic. People stood out of habit, not knowing yet who they were rising for. But when Judge Lorraine Bennett stepped forward, robe crisp, posture upright, scalp newly shorn but head held high, every eye turned. Some blinked in confusion. Others whispered. Deputy Marshal Brent Hanley went pale. He was standing by the far wall, hands folded, trying to blend in. But the moment he locked eyes with Lorraine, there was nowhere to hide. His jaw tightened, shoulders squared. But the bravado he wore just hours ago had vanished. Judge Bennett didn't address him. Not yet. She took her seat at the bench and adjusted the microphone with deliberate calm. "Court is now in session," she said, voice unwavering. The attorneys on both sides fidgeted slightly, sensing something was different. Not in the docket, not in the legal motions, in the air. Hanley remained frozen near the exit, unsure whether to leave or brace for what was coming. Lorraine scanned the courtroom, not to intimidate, but to absorb. This wasn't just about her. It never was. She had entered that courthouse the way thousands of others had, without a title on their chest, without a name known to the guards. And for that, she was presumed unworthy, stripped of dignity. But she had something those others didn't, the bench. And she was going to use it. Older viewers watching this might feel something stir, because they've been there. Maybe not in a courtroom, maybe not with clippers, but they remember the bus seat they were told not to take, the loan they were denied with no explanation, the store clerk who watched them, not to help, but to follow. And still, they showed up to work the next day. They raised children, they kept going. That's what Lorraine did now. From the gallery, an elderly black man in a tweed blazer leaned forward. His name was Harold Jameson, a retired Army sergeant. He had seen his own son stopped 5 times in 1 year outside their apartment, always for routine checks. Harold hadn't planned on staying the whole trial, but when he saw Lorraine on that bench, fresh scars on her scalp, he whispered under his breath, "You hold steady now." And she did. Because this time, the woman they overlooked was the one who could make the record permanent. The moment ended not with shouting, but with silence, a kind of stillness that comes before something important. Then Lorraine looked directly at Hanley. No judgment, not yet. Just a calm, steady gaze, one that said, "I remember everything, and I'm not done." The next day, the courtroom was packed, not with cameras, not with press, but with people. Court employees, clerks, legal aides, faces normally buried in files, now filled the benches, drawn by something they didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. Judge Lorraine Bennett called the court to order, but her voice carried something different. Not volume, not anger, intent. She picked up a folder, thicker than most, and opened it without drama. "This court has received formal complaints regarding the conduct of Deputy Marshal Brent Hanley," she began. "These are not new allegations. Some date back over a decade." No one moved. Not a cough. Not a shuffling of papers. She read them aloud, line by line. The time a woman in a wheelchair was denied entry, the time a teenage boy was searched without cause, the time a public defender was asked if she really belonged here. Each complaint had been quietly dismissed. Lorraine looked at the gallery. The court notes that in each case, the internal review concluded there was insufficient evidence to proceed. She closed the file. Yet the stories are nearly identical. From the back, Hanley stood rigid, his face no longer blank. It was clenched. Lorraine didn't look at him. Not yet. Because this moment wasn't about him. It was about the people who had come here expecting dignity, and left feeling erased. For viewers aged 60 or older, this wasn't just a court case. It was déjà vu. They'd seen files disappear, apologies whispered, never written, and they knew the cost of being told over and over again, "You misunderstood." Otis Raymond, 75, sat in the second row. A retired construction worker from Birmingham, he had once filed a complaint after being punched in the stomach by a sheriff's deputy for talking too much. Nothing came of it, no hearing, not even a callback. He watched Judge Bennett now with folded arms and moist eyes. "She's not yelling," he whispered to the woman beside him. "She don't need to." Because when the truth is on paper, you don't have to scream. You just have to read. Lorraine turned back to the bench, her voice steady, her spine straight. This court recognizes that patterns of abuse do not emerge from nowhere. They persist when accountability is replaced by convenience. Finally, she looked at Hanley. This court will no longer be convenient, and with that, she ordered the records unsealed, available for federal review. Somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Not relief, not yet. But the beginning of it. The silence was no longer heavy. It was listening. The room was still but not quiet. There's a kind of sound that comes when people are trying not to move, when every breath is calculated, every shift of weight careful, as if noise itself might break the spell. Judge Lorraine Bennett sat steady behind the bench, the folder now closed, the records laid bare. But she knew the next moment wouldn't come from her. It had to come from someone else. Then it did. A voice from the left side of the gallery, soft but sure. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak." Heads turned. It was Madison Cho, a clerk barely out of law school, usually invisible to everyone but the copy machine. She stood up slowly, hands clasped tight in front of her. Lorraine didn't flinch. She just nodded once. "Proceed." Madison's voice trembled but didn't break. 6 months ago, I filed a complaint. Not about being touched, not about being yelled at, just being ignored, like I didn't count. She paused. The room leaned in. Deputy Hanley blocked me from entering through the staff door 3 times. Each time, I showed him my badge. Each time he waved in someone behind me and told me to wait. She looked straight ahead, not at Hanley. So I waited, until one day I stopped trying. It wasn't a dramatic accusation, no headline, but it landed with weight, because everyone in that room, especially the older ones, understood exactly what she meant. That slow erosion of value. Not by force, but by design. Evelyn Carter, 69, a retired public school teacher, sat in the back row, her heart clenched. She remembered the year she started teaching. A white principal told her, "You're here on paper, but they're not ready for you yet." She didn't quit, but a part of her spirit cracked. Watching Madison now, she felt something rise. Not just anger, recognition. One by one, others began to stand. A bailiff who'd stayed silent for 8 years. A janitor who once watched a woman cry in the stairwell but had no power to help. A paralegal who remembered when her complaint disappeared without explanation. It wasn't a protest. It was a reckoning. Lorraine didn't try to contain it. She let the room speak. Because justice doesn't always begin with verdicts. Sometimes it begins with voices. Madison sat down, tears quietly rolling down her face, not from shame, but from release. Lorraine let the moment breathe. Then she said, "The record now reflects your testimony. No fanfare, no applause, just the sound of silence, finally broken. And in that break, a shift. Not loud, but undeniable." The next witness didn't need an invitation. Lieutenant Dennis Walcott had been sitting in the hallway, waiting. He wasn't summoned by the court. He was asked by Judge Bennett herself, in a private letter sealed with her initials. Now he took the stand, dressed in uniform, medals on his chest, posture straight. But medals don't speak louder than silence, and Walcott knew his past would have to speak for itself. Lorraine began calmly. "Lieutenant, do you recall the protest outside this courthouse last November?" "I do." "Were you on duty during the incident involving the deployment of tear gas and physical restraint on unarmed civilians?" "I was." "And do you believe the response was proportionate?" He hesitated. "It followed protocol." Lorraine leaned forward, but her voice never rose. "Protocol? Whose?" The room stiffened. Walcott looked down. "Internal policy, not federal." "Was Deputy Hanley involved in that response?" "Yes." "Did he act within your policy, or did he go beyond it?" Long pause. "He went beyond." A murmur ran through the gallery. Lorraine continued, each word paced like a metronome. "And what were the consequences?" Walcott swallowed. "None. I filed a note. It was closed." There it was, not an explosion, just the quiet confirmation of everything people in that room already suspected. Darnell Whitman, 66, leaned back in his seat. A retired bus driver from Savannah, he'd once been forced to lie on the pavement after police stopped him for fitting a description. His voice was never loud, but his memory was long. "This is the part," he whispered to no one in particular, "where they start blaming the system, as if the system wasn't made by men." Lorraine nodded slowly. "Lieutenant, is it your understanding that Deputy Hanley's conduct over the years, inside and outside this courtroom, was widely known?" Walcott nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And why was he never removed?" He didn't have an answer. That was the answer. Lorraine turned to the gallery. "This court has been asked to believe that injustice is accidental, that abuse is an error in judgment, that silence is a technicality." Then she looked directly at the Department of Justice official seated in the second row. "Do you still believe this courthouse deserves exemption from federal review?" The official stood. "No, Your Honor." "Effective immediately, Charleston Federal Courthouse is under full review." No applause, just stillness. The kind that comes when an institution long seen as untouchable finally gets touched. Lorraine closed her folder, placed her hands atop it, and looked out across the room. She didn't smile, because this wasn't a victory. It was an opening. And openings, she knew, only mattered if people stepped through them. The arrest was quiet. No handcuffs in the middle of a shouting match. No dramatic takedown. Just 2 federal agents in plain suits stepping through the side door, approaching Deputy Marshal Brent Hanley with a warrant and a sentence he had never expected to hear. "You are under federal arrest for civil rights violations under color of law." He didn't resist. He didn't speak. As they walked him out, his eyes searched the gallery for something. Perhaps an ally, perhaps an excuse, but all he found were faces that had already turned away. Judge Lorraine Bennett did not watch him leave. She remained seated, reviewing documents being handed up by her clerk. These weren't part of the day's agenda. They were new. Inside the folders were names, dozens of them, former complaints, sealed cases, internal memos bearing the initials of judges who had once overridden disciplinary action against Hanley. At the top of the stack, Judge Clifford Rames, a colleague, a mentor, a man Lorraine had once considered part of the foundation. Her hand hovered over the file for a moment. Then she opened it. For the people in the gallery, especially the older ones, this was the part they'd seen go wrong before. They knew how quickly a system would sacrifice one man to protect the rest, throw out the offender, preserve the order. But this time, something was different. Mrs. Geraldine Falk, 74, who had spent her career in the city library, knew this pattern well. "They always blame the rotten apple," she had once said. "Never ask why the tree keeps bearing the same fruit." Now, she watched Judge Bennett not stop at the apple. Lorraine spoke clearly. "This court acknowledges that the misconduct of Deputy Hanley did not occur in isolation. Judicial records show patterns of administrative shielding and ethical avoidance." She paused. "This includes interference from members of the bench." A sharp intake of breath swept through the gallery. Not outrage, realization. There would be no easy scapegoat. From her seat, Lorraine looked up at the row of judges seated in the reserved section. Some avoided her gaze, others folded their arms. But one, Clifford Raines, stared straight back. She didn't blink. "Further review of judicial conduct will be undertaken by the Circuit Oversight Committee." Her gavel didn't slam. It tapped once. That sound, light but certain, was louder than any verdict, because the wall wasn't just cracking, it was being inspected, brick by brick. And this time, the blueprint was in the right hands. The list grew longer each day. They didn't come with lawyers, most didn't even plan to speak, but one by one, they showed up, sitting quietly at the back, holding folded papers, sometimes no more than a memory scribbled on the corner of a receipt. Judge Lorraine Bennett asked for their names, not for the record, for the truth. Mrs. Elaine Prescott was the first that morning. 62, retired nurse, walking with a cane. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. "In 2009, I was stopped outside this building. I was told my ID looked fake. I was here to testify in a medical fraud case, but I missed my time slot. They marked me as a no-show. I never got another chance." She paused, took a breath. "It wasn't just one man who made me feel small. It was the silence around him that kept me there." The courtroom didn't applaud. They listened. Next was Daniel Reyes, a veteran who'd once been homeless for nearly 3 years. His testimony wasn't about violence. It was about being invisible. "I walked into the clerk's office with my discharge papers. They told me I smelled like a problem." Then came Adrienne Green, a mother who had brought her son for jury duty and ended up detained for disrupting court operations. Her only disruption? Asking where the restroom was. Each story had been swept aside. Each voice had once been ignored, but now they were written into the official transcript, line by line, under oath. For older viewers, this wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. They knew how power protects itself, how dignity is often denied not with force, but with the quiet shrug of indifference. Virgil Lewis, 78, sat in the gallery. A Marine in his younger days, he once filed a complaint when a fellow veteran was dragged out of a public office for asking too many questions. That file disappeared, but Virgil never forgot the sound of his friend's boots on marble as he was pulled out, boots polished for service, not for shame. Watching the testimony now, Virgil felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not revenge, but validation. These weren't outbursts, they were reckonings, gentle, steady, undeniable. When Judge Bennett finally stood, she removed her robe in full view of the room. Not as a resignation, not as a symbol, as a message. "I wear this robe because I believe in the law," she said. "But I remove it today to say something as a citizen. I will not be silent in the face of what this court has ignored." She folded it neatly on the bench, then faced the crowd. "For too long, your pain was paperwork, your silence was policy. That ends here." And as she stepped down from the bench, not out of duty, but into something bigger, the room stood with her, because in that moment, she wasn't just a judge. She was one of them. The courtroom filled again the next morning, but this time, it wasn't for testimony. It was for judgment. Brent Hanley sat at the defense table, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, and an expression that had grown more hollow with each passing day. No one sat beside him. His legal counsel had filed the final paperwork and left the city. Judge Lorraine Bennett had returned to the bench. The robe was back on, the voice unchanged. She didn't spend long summarizing the facts. They had already been made plain. The evidence wasn't complicated, the abuse wasn't hidden. But before she delivered the sentence, she paused. "Mr. Hanley," she began, "the maximum penalty under federal law for civil rights violations, obstruction, and abuse under color of law is what I am about to impose. Not because it will undo what you've done, but because it will say, finally, that what you did mattered. She took a breath. You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The room didn't react, not in noise, but in stillness. A stillness that said, "It's been a long time coming." Then Judge Bennett continued, not as a judge, but as someone who had seen what silence does when left unchallenged. This sentence is not just about you. It's about every person who stood behind a badge and used it to demean, not to serve. About every file that was closed too early, every complaint labeled as a misunderstanding. She glanced toward the gallery, and for every person watching, wondering if they still matter in a system that told them otherwise, this courtroom says yes, you matter. And your story will not be erased. Rose Middleton, 70, watched from the third row. Her husband had once been wrongfully arrested, held for 72 hours, and released without charge. He never filed a complaint. "What's the point?" he used to say. But now, Rose sat straighter. Because the point was here, in this room, in this sentence. Brent Hanley didn't make eye contact. He was led out quietly. No outburst. Just the slow walk of a man who realized too late that power borrowed without conscience eventually comes due. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Bennett remained seated, not because she was waiting, but because she knew some things take a moment to settle. Justice, for example. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it arrives in quiet echoes, from a gavel tap to a folded robe, to the breath of a woman who had waited years to exhale. The stage wasn't a courtroom this time. It was a federal ceremony hall in Washington, D.C., framed by muted flags and soft camera flashes. The crowd stood as Judge Lorraine Bennett walked forward, not in robes, not in heels, but in quiet dignity. Her head still bore the memory of what had been taken, though her posture said nothing had been lost. She approached the podium where the president waited with an open box. "This year's Presidential Medal of Justice," he said, "goes to a woman who reminded this nation that silence is not neutrality, and that the law, in the right hands, is not just a shield, but a light." When the medal was placed around her neck, Lorraine didn't smile for the cameras. She looked toward the audience. "I accept this," she said, "not for a victory, but for a truth. The truth that justice delayed is not always justice denied, as long as someone stays long enough to speak it." Then she paused and added something quieter. "And I dedicate it to those who were never called by name, but never stopped mattering." In a federal prison 3 states away, Brent Hanley watched the ceremony on a mounted TV. The other inmates barely noticed. It was just another broadcast. But he didn't move. He watched the woman he once humiliated, now honored by the highest office in the land. She never looked into the camera, never addressed him. But the moment didn't need words, because sometimes consequence isn't in the sentence, it's in the silence that follows. Back in Charleston, Margaret Maggie Simmons, now 76, sat on her porch with a cup of tea and the ceremony playing on her phone. The sun was low, the wind quiet. She wiped her eyes with a corner of her sleeve. "For all the times they told me to just let it go," she whispered. This says we weren't wrong to remember." She opened the comments section on the live stream. Typed, "Grit and grace. That's what it takes." Then hit send. Across the country, thousands did the same. Not loud declarations, just short sentences, fragments of their own stories finally finding room. And as Lorraine stepped down from the stage and walked toward the exit, she passed a row of young clerks lined up along the aisle. One reached out. "Judge Bennett," she said, "your voice made space for ours." Lorraine didn't stop walking. She just squeezed the young woman's hand, once firmly. Because the fight wasn't over. But something had shifted. Not perfection, not closure, just proof. That truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it only needs to be spoken at the right time. In a society where power is sometimes misused and justice is often delayed, the story of Judge Lorraine Bennett reminds us that truth, no matter how long it's been silenced, can still be spoken at the right moment. The deepest lesson lies not just in the sentence handed down to one wrongdoer, but in the strength of dignity, persistence, and moral courage in the face of injustice. Life often teaches us to stay quiet out of fear, to believe we are too small to make a difference. But like the elders who stood in that courtroom, people once overlooked, once convinced their voices didn't matter, we come to understand that every voice has value when spoken with clarity, and purpose. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise, but through quiet, unwavering action. In our daily lives, this story reminds us to hold on to integrity, to speak up when it matters, and not let old wounds convince us to give up. Because what's right doesn't need to shout to exist. It only needs someone willing to face the truth and refuse to look away. She didn't set out to become a symbol. Lorraine Bennett simply refused to let silence be her answer. And in doing so, she became something more than a judge. She became a reminder that dignity is not something others grant you. It's something you protect, even when no one is watching. That power may try to humiliate you, but it cannot define you. And that justice, though slow, still moves when the right hands carry it forward. This story wasn't just about a courtroom. It was about every hallway you've ever walked down feeling unseen. Every time you swallowed your truth because you thought no one would believe it. And every quiet moment you stood your ground, even when no one thanked you for it. So now, it's your turn to speak. Press 1 if you've ever been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel like you didn't belong. Press 2 if you believe that dignity, truth, and courage still matter and always will. Your voice may be one among many, but in a world that often forgets to listen, even one voice can remind us of what's right. And if stories like this speak to your soul, subscribe to stay with us. For truth that doesn't shout, but still echoes,